Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about some of the early products that you worked on really over a decade ago. And I really just want to touch on your background and how many different products you've been involved in that really span across a whole host of different technologies, industries, use cases, and we'll eventually get to how you came to Fleet and security specifically. So I think the first one that you kind of publicize is Hey Jukebox, which, as you described it, was kind of the precursor to Google Play Music. So kind of cloud streaming from a library that you actually own. But tell me a little bit more about just the story there and how it all came together.
Yeah, so I mean that one, it all started in a computer lab where I was sitting there doing some work in college, and this was before smartphones and cheap storage were like super pervasive, and the cloud wasn't quite as fast as it is today. I remember running into the problem of, hey, I wish I could stream my music library from home and listen to it here. Right? So I don't know if there's probably a little bit of marketing on my part to say that it was the precursor to Google Music. It definitely feature wise, right, was, but
Yeah.
definitely not adoption wise. And I remember like calling, I think it was Rackspace, and learning about Colo at the time, which is we're
Okay.
far past that nowadays. But yeah, I mean the key realization there was I remember it was during South by Southwest. I remember having the thought process of like I had never before then put together the idea that companies like Facebook were actually created by somebody and that like I could do that too.
Okay. So, I mean, was there like a trigger in particular that made you think, oh, these companies were founded by an individual, and so now I'm going to go ahead and shoot for the moon? Or was it just kind of like a gradual realization? Was there any point in particular that triggered that?
I just been building Hey Jukebox for fun, or not for fun because I wanted it right for myself, and then it
Right.
was probably the trigger was just like a couple weeks into that as I started to think about like how could I market this for other people to use it, and then the
Yeah.
natural thought next was how could I charge for it.
Okay. And so then one thing led to another. Unfortunately, that one did not turn into the next Facebook, but I think that's how a lot of side projects go for a lot of folks. So what was it like just kind of making the decision after I think it was a year or something like that to go ahead and move on to the next project? Just what was it like? Describe that decision making process for you.
Yeah, so I had been in part of this program called 3 Day Startup actually at
Hmm.
UT in Austin, which is really helpful because it gave some context. It like introduced me to ideas like the lean startup and got me doing some like reading and learning on my own. And I very quickly realized that like the hosting costs of this thing are going to be crazy right now. I barely even know how to run my own server on anything, right? Let alone like host other people's data. And I could start thinking about some fancy algorithm for like saying like, you know what, you also have a pirated copy of like Umbop by Hanson or whatever, right? And but
Sure.
like it was just too much. It was too much work, and it was starting to be very clear that wasn't the right first easy idea to pursue for someone at my skill level, right? So I had met some folks during 3 Day Startup. One of which, when I pitched some investors there who were there, sort of amused, listening to these crazy ideas. And I'd gotten chewed out appropriately, and I was out in the
Sure.
hallway, and I met someone who would later become my lawyer,
Hmm.
which was awesome. Who she was real supportive of me at the time, and so I kind of started building relationships, learning about other people's ideas, and realizing that look, I want to be kind of like a technical co-founder first in one of these
Hmm.
companies. And then one thing kind of led to another, and it was actually when I was working on another project related to volunteering for organizations, or making it easier for nonprofits to get easy access to volunteers,
Hmm.
that I realized, wow, there's a lot of companies that just, or there's a lot of organizations, right, especially nonprofits, who are having trouble doing the most basic things with their
Hmm.
software, like getting anything automated, um, keeping up with their own websites. And
Okay.
then I started to realize like maybe the right path forward here is for me to start a professional services shop
Hmm.
and see if I could help some of these organizations out.
And so was that something that you presumably did at that point and say, okay, instead of trying to build a product right now, let me go ahead and transition into professional services. And then from there, you ended up jumping back into building a product. So, I mean, tell me
Yeah.
about the next stage of that transition, right? As you move into professional services, you do that for a bit. What's the kind of time period on that? How long were you doing that for?
I guess I had just gotten out of, so I got out of college. I was working at a job at a startup actually as an engineer, and I was kind of working. I was working on a bunch of different ideas in my own time, and I sort of
Yeah.
accidentally quit my job and made that jump to professional services, right? So I was like,
Okay.
oh, look, why don't I part time go start build some websites, stuff like that,
Sure.
and then this role that I'm in, I've been building like a bunch of iPhone apps, a bunch of Android apps.
Hmm.
It's my first time I ever touched iTunes Connect and all that stuff. I think they had just renamed it to Google Play at the time. This would have been like
Okay.
2011. Um, and so, yeah, I sort of like, why don't I go part time and I can keep just doing what I've been doing because it's really not, now that I've automated a lot of it, it's not a full time job. And they were like, well, why don't you go no time? And that's how I became an official real entrepreneur that was using it to pay the rent.
Hmm.
So professional services from there, I managed to be able to pay rent, which was great for had
Right.
some awesome early customers. And then I guess it was about 2013. I'd been really excited about Node.js.
Yeah.
I built this. There wasn't an MVC framework for Node like Ruby on Rails, so I built this thing called Sales.js just purely for internal consumption. I was using it on my own projects. I happened to publish it on NPM,
Yeah.
and yeah, lo and behold, and it went viral basically in early 2013. So we became the Sales.js consulting company basically. We
Hmm.
grew to about 15 contractors and employees, and then in 2014 I applied to Y Combinator, got in, and that was actually for a new idea, building a product on top of Sales.js.
Hmm. And so again, I guess there's this kind of whole segue back and forth between these two, where the whole time you're doing professional services, you're not doing maybe what like a lot of people in security would think about for professional services, where it's often more like assessments and strategy, like maybe you're doing pen testing, but your professional services were like focused on product development the whole time. It was just a different
Correct.
model. Instead of saying, hey, I'm going to have an idea, I'm going to go and build it, I'm going to get all the customers, you're saying, hey, someone else is going to bring the idea to me. I'm going to go ahead and build it for them. That way I know I have the revenue stream behind it, right? And then again, you have this kind of transition that you're talking about with sales.js and then transitioning that back into kind of the professional services piece and then again evolving into the product piece. So I'm going to be curious to see how this all comes back together when we talk about just what you've been doing with fleet and device management and how you've kind of tried to replicate that model, if at all, as far as some of the professional services piece. But I also, before we want to move on, want to kind of give you full credit where it's due as far as just the exposure that sales.js got. Because, like you mentioned, it went viral. But when I was doing a little bit of research into it, I think it's like the most popular model view controller framework for Node, which is no small statement. And so, obviously, there's kind of this tricky scenario of, hey, it's open source that you went ahead and developed, and then how do I go ahead and monetize on top of this? But it is clearly a testament to just your technical product building capabilities and being able to make a product that was so successful. So, I mean, I'm curious, talking on that point, the open source decision, right? Was there ever a part of you that was kind of like kicking yourself for making it open source, or was that always like, hey, this was the right thing to do. And if I'm able to make money on top of it, great. But this was never a part of those original plans.
Well, for one thing, I don't want to take all the credit because a lot of what made that particular project successful is that, at least at the beginning, was the fact that I wasn't the only person Googling Node.js MVC framework, and I
Right.
wasn't the only person who was expecting to find something that rhymed with Rails, right? So a lot of it, a lot of that early momentum really came from the fact that there were people out there that were doing the same thing I was, and I was the user, right? So I understood
Right.
it intimately, what I needed from like a marketing perspective to buy into something like this, and also from a increasingly I became the right person to know what was needed from a product perspective,
Hmm.
right? In terms of features. Um, so I think with Sales.js, I never kicked myself that it was open source because that's what I would have needed as a developer,
Hmm.
right?
Sure.
Going back to security and IT these days, we're seeing more and more code literate people get into security and IT.
Yeah.
And I think that coincidentally, open source is on the rise in security and IT, and I think we have to look at that and say there's probably a connection here, right?
Hmm.
Developers like to pick things that they can see the source code for, that they think they could modify it, right? Like, it's not that I necessarily am going to go modify like GitLab, but knowing that I can go look at it and then I might, right, is super valuable to me. So I think with Sales.js, major failure in terms of monetization.
Sure.
But big success in terms of solving needs for users,
Right.
which really was, hey, I just need an easier way to go build something that's as simple as possible and makes me learn as little details as possible, except what I need to achieve my goals.
Hmm. So I feel like we're foreshadowing some elements that might come out with Fleet here, right? You talked about the like, hey, I was a user of this and I wanted, like, I faced this problem. And so I wanted to go ahead and solve it myself. Obviously, see that all the time with successful founders is they have to be passionate about that problem because it was something that they ran into themselves. So, I mean, tell me a little bit more about that. You ended up joining and kind of starting Fleet Device Management in 2020. So you'd done sales JS for I think 7 or 8 years at that point, and said maybe we didn't nail the monetization on this last one. Let's go ahead and try something else. And again, sales JS is built on OSquery, so still kind of keeping this attachment towards open source projects. Again, I have some ideas as far as how this all came together with your love of open source and being a contributor and then trying to build a monetization model on top of it. But let me hear it in your words, just how this whole transition came about and the decision to launch FleetDM.
So we had run out of money with the Sales.js project
Mm.
long ago, right? Back in
Okay.
2016. And what I had done to keep things alive was go back to doing professional services. And at this
Okay.
time, I was a YC founder, right? And so I'd gone through that whole kind of boot camp of like learning to like just talk to users obsessively, like really focus on tiny iterative improvements, doing things that don't scale, going out and doing user acquisition any way you can, right? And I think that was really really helpful in what came next, because then what I did for the next few years was just built a bunch of projects, went way deeper than we had ever done in the past, managed to get the company profitable again just doing that.
Well,
And the company's still in existence. Sales.js actually has revenue. It's being supported by, I think we have either one or two support customers right now. It's a
mm,
trickle, right? But it pays for its own website hosting,
right.
and it takes at this point none of my time other than I think a weekly 30 minutes that I spend. And actually, there's more on that
Pretty
in the
good.
YouTube video, which is
Okay.
great. Yeah, like I mean, we figured out how to get open source running smoothly, and we figured out how to. And I think during that same time, I learned how to be a better manager. I learned how to like run companies a little bit better, and also just run a product development process a little bit better, a little bit more empathetically. So, anyways, fast forward to like 2020. I meet Zach. We're actually introduced by Stitzy Brandy from GitLab, who was in the
Mm,
same Y Combinator batch as me. So GitLab, bought our office furniture right when we moved away from California back to Austin, Texas. And anyway, so Zach and I meet, and one of the things from the Sales.js project is I had built this ORM, if you're an ORM, which is a way to talk to the database that's easier than writing SQL queries by themselves, right?
mm,
But a key piece of doing that was this realization that like there's really nothing about this that says it has to be a database, right? You can find data using the same kind of interface from Twitter, right, or from any API.
sure.
We could use it to detect the state of a lamp that's on or off. I remember we sawed an extension cord in half once, and we used the ORM to like turn on and off a lamp, right?
Huh.
Um, that was always really exciting to me, and something I never got to invest as much time in as I wanted. And so when Zach started telling me about like OSquery and about how it was a way to do that to computers like in general and be able to like fetch data from anywhere on the laptop or the server and like create this abstraction of SQL tables, except like way better than I was thinking of doing it, where it actually uses the SQLite query engine and like it lets you join and do subqueries and is just really, really neat. So I got really excited immediately from that. And then I also, after having kind of talked to Sid more, I learned more about how to do a more effective open core business model.
Hmm.
So with kind of those two pieces, this was just like, this is definitely what I'm doing next. And so Zach and I got together. We didn't actually meet in person for months
Okay.
after that point. So we actually got to our almost probably first 500,000 in revenue before we ever met face to face.
Wow. That's a pretty good testament, I think, both on the timeline of building that first 500,000 in revenue and from a just team management standpoint. So, I mean, I think it's worth for the listeners maybe diving into OSquery just a little bit more and talking about like what it is that OSquery is trying to accomplish. And obviously, you're going to be more of an expert on this than I am, but the maybe 10-second version is essentially providing telemetry into all the different devices and endpoints on your network. So commonly used in security operations centers, trying to capture that telemetry, forwarding it out to a SIM. So that way security analysts can go ahead and consume logs from those endpoints in a standardized fashion across, again, across an entire ecosystem. So anything in particular you'd add as far as like key elements of OSquery? I mean, I think the SQL backend structure seems to be a kind of important one as we talk about just digesting that data. But anything else?
No, you nailed it. I mean, there's more. There's actually a good podcast that Zach did where he goes with Mike Arpaia. They work together at Facebook, and he talks about like
Hmm,
some of the motivations, and that's really interesting if you're just trying to get that historical context for where kind of security
sure.
has been coming from and where it's going. So I won't go into that here, but I think a more maybe what I can just add is on top of what you said, one thing that a lot of people find value in is FIM or file integrity monitoring. So being
Hmm,
able to use OSquery to actually monitor for changes on disk to certain files, especially helpful on servers, right, where you don't want the files changing, or if they do, it's weird. Um, and then the other thing is just why you would be doing this in the first place today. And that's really, I think, because you want that data to augment what you already have in your SIM, right? Like maybe
sure.
you're getting some data from your EDR, and maybe you have some existing solutions floating around your network that feed you some data, but you are missing like the ability to get custom fine-grained access to specific pieces of data on the
Hmm,
computers, right? So maybe that's like you want all process events, or you're wanting to get involved with eBPF. Like maybe you're using some other kind of framework to look at activity and to do some more advanced security detections. Um, that's all like whatever you end up trying to do at the end of the day in your sim is something you're going to want to have more data than just what OSquery gives you. But when it comes to like getting the actual reality of what's living on that endpoint, OSquery is one of the most flexible and kind of fine-grained ways that you can get exactly the data you need.
right. No, I think that's a great summary as far as kind of the use cases in different organizations. And I mean, I've seen things in the past, right, where like a big enterprise might have an EDR system for some of their ecosystem, like for example, let's say all Windows endpoints, but then they don't have a solution for their Mac endpoints. So they end up relying on something like OSquery to go ahead and capture additional telemetry until they can find like a contract with a different EDR system to help bridge that gap. And then to your point, maybe they have OSquery tailored for specific event types there as well that they want to ensure that they monitor. Now, one of the things I'm curious about, right, is a common challenge in just security monitoring in general is the volume of data that's being ingested from all these various sources. And so I've worked with several companies in the past who've just expressed some hesitations or frustrations around OSquery because of how much data they're getting into their sim. And obviously, a big piece of that is how are they tailoring it? What are some of the other supporting tools in their ecosystem? What are the rules that they're building within the sim to make sure that they're only triggering on like actually malicious events as opposed to the broader swath of events that they're going to get from something like an OS query? So, I mean, what's your perspective on that problem and maybe how the security industry as a whole is trying to address that?
So OSquery will give you whatever you ask it for, right?
Right.
So you can go find a bunch of community queries online, copy and
Hmm,
paste them, or run fleet control apply and add them to your fleet instance and start running them on all of your hosts. And you can start pumping the data out directly to your SIM, and a lot of folks get that far, and they're like, we got our data, right? And that's kind of step one. Despite the sim data usage costs being as high as they are, whether or not it's like a true sim or you're using some other data platform like a sim, usage-based pricing is kind of where we're at, right? And it's the
Yep.
future of that world. So I think people have to make a choice when they use OSquery or when they use any solution, right?
Sure.
And this is actually informed by the developer side, like picking a framework, picking a library kind of thing too. You're always like doing a trade-off between like I'm accepting someone else's mental model, and I'm also accepting hopefully the support that they're providing for that like mental model and way of thinking about whatever it is. In this case, pulling data out of my devices. And I mean, the cool thing with OSquery is that you can cut out all of that and get just what you want. But the reality is that there's just not, most of the time, if you can get other existing queries that are out there, you're going to start from those.
Right.
So I think a lot of folks will grab those queries, start sucking out data, and then optimizing back to basically cut out what they aren't actually using.
Interesting.
Some of the companies that we've seen be most effective with their strategy is to have security engineers who are looking at these queries, deciding like what is it that we actually need to do the detections we want to build, and ideally kind of in the same way you might wireframe a user interface before you go code it up.
Sure.
They're kind of thinking about like here's what I want to actually detect. Let me go use my analysis, right? Me, the security engineer, or me, the CISO, or whoever's driving that strategy, depending on how big you are. And let me go find the queries that I think make sense, and get the data for that. So I think a lot of it goes back to just do you get more data than you need and sort it out later, or do we just ask just the questions that we need answers for?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really good delineation of those two different scenarios, right? And I think one of the problems that a lot of organizations run into is they might have security engineers who are familiar with rule writing in their SIM, right? If they're using Splunk, for example, they can go ahead and write a Splunk query. But if they then need to go ahead and learn OS query syntax as well, and now they're starting to manage rules in different places. They have some rules at the SIM level, they have some rules at the OS query level, and maybe the rule at the OS query level is just an event type, but ultimately it's going to impact the types of security events that you have insight into, right? And so all of a sudden, these are going to be somewhat coupled with the security rules that you're developing. And again, so more than anything, that's just creating more overhead for that security analyst team. I mean, as I think about that scenario a little bit more, are you saying that kind of the main reason companies opt for that approach is really to reduce the usage for the SIM and just the volume of data that's coming in and the costs that come along with that?
I think that can be a justification for sure.
Sure.
I think it definitely has done that. We've seen companies go from I forget how many terabytes of OSquery data down to like 100 megabytes in terms of, I'm talking like
Wow.
volume per month, in just
Wow.
spending like 2 days, right? Like cutting back to be like, we don't need every event that's ever happened, nor do you necessarily even want to store all that, right?
Right.
For lots of reasons. But I think what motivates a lot of companies that are really leaning in heavily to OSquery, like Atlassian, is they look at whatever choice they're going to make for the next 3 years for vendors or open source tools. And at this point, most EDR vendors are using OSquery under the hood anyway. And so when you look at what's a kind of portable format that's going to put me in control of my own strategy, OSquery is a pretty great option. Like it's
Hmm.
SQL, so it's a language that's been around since the 70s in terms of what you're specifying. Like, and then the results you're getting back are shaped in a consistent way. OSquery has enough adoption that it's versioned. You're not going to get some random vendor surprise. There's still all kinds of spots in OSquery that need some love, and like at Fleet, we're investing heavily in that because we realize, making the user experience as good as possible of OSquery itself is going to kind of lift all boats, sort of.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think we have two folks working on that full time right now, and we are hiring for a third.
Hmm.
Um, And I think even then, it'll probably take, before we can look at every single table and say that that is the exact user experience, the developer experience we want. That'll probably always be a moving target.
Sure.
Um, but I think we're getting a lot closer lately. And I guess for anyone that checked out OSquery like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I would really recommend, even 6 months ago, I would recommend having a look now, especially on Mac OS. There's a lot of really cool stuff.
Interesting. And I want to dive more into that statement that you made about reducing 100 terabytes of monthly data into 100 megabytes in just a couple of days, because I think there's probably some folks who are listening and heard that and their ears just immediately perked up, because the amount of savings that comes along with that is incredible, and what that's really going to open up for your security budget to be able to repurpose some of that spend in different areas is, again, pretty incredible in itself. So I'm curious, what's the approach when you go through that process? I mean, it sounds like part of it is just scoping your use cases effectively and saying, hey, here's what we actually need. And so let's go ahead and just make sure that we only have those queries turned on. But are there any other kind of like, hey, here are the top 3 things for someone using OSquery to go ahead and take a look at and make sure that like these flags are turned off, for example, or like the retention that you're setting is something that you look into?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer that specifically, and then I'll zoom out a little bit and hope I won't get too
Perfect.
bad on you. But the thing I would look at first, right? If you're using OSquery today and you're like, wow, it's a lot of data. The first thing is that you might have a bit of an organizational rift you need to heal, right? Between the people that are in the sim and the people that are defining those queries. One thing we've learned about at Fleet is it's really important to get the people that are getting the result of the questions you're asking, like that are receiving those answers,
Hmm.
to be communicating with the people that are asking those questions. Um,
Right.
'Cause otherwise, how can you really ever be successful? I would say that's the number one problem that we've seen is just the people on the receiving end are not the same people on the asking end, and
Hmm.
they're not communicating. So we added some features around that, specifically this thing called Teams, because we realized the easier we made it to get folks into actually seeing OSquery. We have a little Ace editor that shows up in the browser,
Hmm.
which you also don't have to use. You can use, GetOps, and you can put it all in YAML and use your existing
Sure.
pull request process. But being able to add observers kind of at will, you can even let your IT help desk in, look at the queries, even run queries that have been like allow listed as, hey, that's not going to shut down and freeze everybody's mouse cursors. But also just your security analyst, right? Like letting them see, like, okay, from whence did this data come? And like, what is the question we're asking? Like, you don't even have to necessarily empower those people to do edits, although that's even better. But if you can give those folks just visibility into like what kind of questions are being asked, then they can do a lot better job being like, oh, okay, I know what produced this data that I'm looking at, and I can make the most of it. I can also say, hey, we don't need this data. You don't need to be
Right.
asking that question, right? Um, and then I think specifically for OSquery, the evented tables are ones that can very, very quickly sprawl the amount of data that you're
Hmm.
consuming, or producing, right, from OSquery and then consuming in your sim.
Right.
So we've
Right.
seen people get a lot of benefit after cutting down on the use of evented tables to being what they actually need to do the detections that they want to build.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think we've hinted at a lot of the kind of like specific benefits that you set out to build when you decided to tackle this project for fleet device management. But like thinking through everything you've described, it feels almost like more of a professional services focus, right? Because everything that you're describing, like that process of saying, hey, here's what you need, here's what you don't need, that seems like the classic approach or process for a consulting project. So I think part of what you've touched on here as well is some of the like UI benefits and just again that ORM in terms of making this data more accessible. But I'm curious to hear again, like thinking back a couple years ago when you decided to really kick this off, what were like the top 3 goals that you said, hey, if we can do these 3 things, we're succeeding as a company and customers are going to be interested.
Mm. So we needed, and I'll drop a link for you, Kyle, so we can put this in the show notes. But
Perfect.
there's this great talk that Sid C. Brandy from GitLab does, where he talks about like how they landed on open core,
Hmm.
um, and it's awesome because he goes through like when they first hit Hacker News, he's getting his pancakes. right? Or he's making pancakes, and kind of like what it took to get there, right? Going from trying literally every monetization strategy that they could think of, right? And adoption strategy that they could think of, and it's super relevant if you've ever built open source or even just had a small community package that kind of got popular.
Hmm.
So one of the things came out of that for this company was like we Zach and I both knew going in, we had to have a actual product that people wanted to pay for. This could not just be services and support. It needed to have
Right.
paid features that mattered. Um, and and so we very quickly worked towards that. That was one of the kind of the first goals, is like get a licensing thing built in so that there's a reason. Like companies need a justification to pay for open source,
Hmm.
and also there's the value in those features that it's just hard to get over the psychology of like, oh, I love those guys. I just want to give them money for no reason, right? Or I want to talk to them more. So and that can't be your business model, right? So that
Yeah.
was part of it. The other thing is we knew that quality and user experience and developer experience were going to be really important. So that comes mostly, first and foremost, just putting ourselves in our users' shoes and talking to users as much as possible
Hmm.
to get to where we understood. I guess that might be where the connection to kind of the professional services world and can sound like that's what we're doing, but there's a pretty big difference in terms of like, we're not gonna, just because someone gives us some feedback doesn't mean that we're gonna do exactly that in the product.
Sure.
Um, but it allows us to have better empathy. And we really tried to have a culture at our company where everybody is thinking about the user all the time, be it the customer or the free user, it doesn't matter, but the
Sure.
people that are actually using the platform.
And so maybe can you just expand a little bit more on like the specific use cases that FleetDM is solving on top of OSquery? So like what is that specific advantage that users get when they transition from just like basic open source open OS query towards the FleetDM package on top of it?
Yeah, so OSquery is an agent, right? It's a daemon. It runs in the background
Yep.
on your. You have OSquery deinstalled, and you've got it on there somehow, right? If you're at a big company, they might have used like Chef or Puppet or Ansible to kind of blast it
Yep.
out to you. Or if it's a laptop we're talking about rather than a server, maybe you got it via their MDM, like Jamf or Kanji, Workspace ONE, Intune, something like that. So you have the daemon running and it got deployed onto your computer. Now you have to send that data somewhere.
Right.
And out of the box, OSquery doesn't do that at all. OSquery is just the agent. So you need a TLS server to receive incoming data and also to be able to ask questions via live queries for incident response use cases or just kind
Hmm.
of ad hoc questions you might have, right, about your fleet. And Fleet is the platform that enables that.
Hmm.
Um, and that's all free. So everything I just said you can do for free. You can send data
Right.
to your SIM for free. The paid features are a lot more about giving additional access, especially when you have multiple teams that need to get into the products, to kind of lock things down a little bit more, control with granular permissions,
Sure.
what people can do in the platform. And then also to be able to kind of segment your fleet more and say like, okay, those are the computers that have, or those are my laptops that have like root access to our production infrastructure. Maybe those are the laptops that have, uh, maybe just IT support, not even IT support, just general support use cases, more likely to get exposed to all kinds of different tools, right? Maybe even you have a few laptops on your security team with people that adopt, they're kind of in sandbox mode and they try things out first.
Sure.
Um, so to be able to kind of partition your fleet in that way, that's part of Fleet Premium today.
And so the more I'm thinking about this, the more I'm thinking it's kind of separate from like the monitoring use case that Sims are focused on, right? It sounds like it's more focused on what are some of the kind of like long-standing um, like metadata about each of these different devices that are relevant for security purposes. So rather than saying, hey, Fleet is enabling you or kind of your central monitoring hub for like malicious activity across your ecosystem, you're saying, no, well, that's really still going to be more the SIM. This is more for that kind of hey, we want to go ahead and clean up our device ecosystem and understand like which endpoints the users have root on, I think was the example you gave. And that allows security to go ahead and do cleanup in a very targeted basis, as opposed to having to reactively respond to some of those alerts. Am I getting that all right?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think using those, and once you have those delineations set up, using them to be able to have different data collection rules based
Sure.
on those use cases, because maybe you don't need to collect as much data from computers that don't have access to production cloud infrastructure. Maybe you don't
Yeah.
need all that to flow to your SIM. Maybe you don't want to necessarily monitor for vulnerabilities as closely. Like if someone's Figma desktop app has a unusual vulnerability in it, like how much does that matter, right? Well, that matters a lot, like what they have access to, right?
Right.
If it's a laptop they open once a year to do some testing and they maybe browse the internet, it's like it's risk, but it's pretty low risk. Like you'd have to have a compromised Nintendo Switch on the network that like sends a like somehow manages to get on
Yeah,
the
sure.
computer with like a open port or something, So it's a lot more of a jumping through hoops to see why it's a risk, but that all changes depending on the context.
Yeah, I think going back to what we talked about previously, right? The additional overhead that comes for security analysts when they have to write rules for all these different scenarios. I think what you just touched on there is super important in terms of telling that value story. Just in, hey, you can go ahead and write rules in this one place, and we'll dynamically go ahead and kind of push those out to the different device types. And so that way you can be sure that the information that you're collecting from even different device types at like a very granular level is specific to those devices, and you're limiting that ingestion um, for the data usage point as well. So no, that totally makes sense to me.
And it's a win from a privacy perspective too, right? Because the other costs aside from you know the the sim cost and just the electricity that you're using to like crank all this data over the internet is you also are storing people's data and they're on their work machines. Hopefully, sometimes you'll have BYOD devices enrolled as well, but you want to be transparent with people about what you're monitoring, and it's really hard to be transparent if you're just collecting everything under the sun.
Yep.
Right. So a thing we're trying to achieve with Fleet is to make it as easy as possible for employers, especially when it comes to monitoring laptops, right? To tell employees, hey, this is like what we capture, and kind of here's why. We're not trying to just get you in trouble because I don't know. We're not trying to like peer into your medical history or see like what pictures of your kids are on your desktop. Like these are the goals. This is like literally what we can see, and this is what we're gonna do with the data. And we're seeing that becoming more and more important to users, kind of, and employees everywhere. Even I think New York just passed a law related to this, actually.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was going to say that's a great point because there is this trend as a whole that customers are increasingly valuing their privacy when they purchase a product or when they use a platform. And I think to your point, the next step of that is employees starting to take more care in how their company handles their personal data. I know there have been companies I've worked with in the past that have like browser monitoring software installed on all their endpoints, and it doesn't seem like their users, their employees, really know about that. And so you create this kind of lack of trust where that monitoring information is hidden and more of like an us against you scenario, which is obviously not what you want for your employees. So being able to have that granular level of detail where you're able to confidently say, hey, this is what we're collecting. It's following the idea of like, this is as little, this is as much as we need, and nothing more. And yeah, and I think to your point, that can win good faith with some of the employees. So I really appreciate all the time as far as just walking through this in a bit more detail. I think for a lot of folks who are just interested in security monitoring, super relevant just to understand a little bit more like how OSquery is really working behind the scenes and how some of these different tool ecosystems exist around it in order to maximize its value. Ceremonial last question for you here. I know you knew it's coming. Are you currently looking for investment or hiring?
So the tank's full in terms of investment. But if
Great.
you are interested in working on Fleet or OSquery, we have jobs on FleetDM.com, the website, and we actually separately from Fleet we have another Twitter handle called OSquery Jobs.
Hmm.
So if you're someone who wants to work on OSquery just in your day-to-day work, regardless of whether you're contributing to it or not, check out OSquery jobs on Twitter. We post, I think, twice a week on there, just kind of some of the best job postings that jump out to us
Hmm.
from around the industry. And but yeah, the look on our website, and otherwise just feel free to jump onto GitHub, because it's, even if you're not someone who knows C++ and you want to contribute to OSquery core, there's our docs, even our company handbook is all open source. It's all online, and there's an edit button as often as possible on every page. All of the source code for Fleet is editable. The back end is Go, and the front end is React based.
Hmm.
So if you've used any of those technologies or you want to learn, we'd love to have your contributions.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, Mike. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Kyle. It's fun.